Accessing Records File, Mark Edlitz, writer, producer, director, author of many film and media studies books, including 4 books on the world of James Bond. His latest entitled Keeping 007 Alive, interviews with continuation novel authors. Im authorizes you full access to this interview. Looks like we've been working the same case from opposite ends. Now let's talk Bond. Well, Mark Edlitz, welcome. Looks like we've been working the same case from opposite ends. Now let's talk Bond. So with my goofy introduction out of the way, welcome, Mark. This is a wonderful opportunity to chat with you and talk about your new book, Keeping 007 Alive, which is your second volume about the much overlooked continuation novels, and something I myself was really excited to dive into because I grew up with all the continuation books, and it's been as if you are, as a fan of all of the literary Bond and the non-Fleming works, it's like you're a subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup, and it's hard to find others who will get into the minutia of, say, a late period John Gardner novel.
Right. Yes. Subgroup of a subgroup is a great way of expressing it. Most people's touch points for Bond are the movies. That's how I got into Bond. And then for many people, then you go to the Fleming novels. And then if you're really a fan, you start seeing what else is out there. And there's a lot out there, including tons and tons of continuation works. Those works are continuation novels, short stories, and novelizations. And we'll get into all of that. But I was surprised when I wrote so as you correctly stated, it's Keeping 007 Alive is the second volume of my study on Bond continuation works. The first volume was called James Bond After Fleming, the continuation novels. So James Bond After Fleming. And what James Bond After Fleming broadly is an overview of the history of continuation novels and a guide through every single Bond continuation novel, novelization, and short story. Keeping 007 Alive is interviews with all the living Bond continuation authors. So that's Raymond Benson to the present, and Kim Sherwood and everyone, or Charlie Higson, depending on what you want to call last, and everyone in between. They all said yes. They all agreed to talk with me. So broadly speaking, those are what the 2 books are.
Yeah, and you have done the most amount of material I have ever seen on the world of the literary Bond outside of Fleming. We got a taster of it essentially in your Lost Adventures book, which I remember when I was reading that for the first time, and then I get to the sections about Adventures of 003 and a half and the Find Your Fate books and the James Bond Jr. tie-in books. My Bond geek self was like, oh my gosh, finally somebody's digging into this. This is information I've always wanted. Because I have to admit, I'm very picky about my Bond books. I'll read anything that's a Bond book, but 90% of the time there's not much in terms of information that's new to me. So there's a lot of really great Bond books, but it's hard for me to get excited about one because there's a lot of, well, unfortunately there's a lot of people who are no longer with us, so it's not like you can call people up on the phone. And I know you ran into that on this one, just looking at the continuation authors who are no longer with us in 2024. But when I started reading your books, it was a lot of the stuff I had always wondered about, a lot of long-held fan questions a lot of people have had, and your ability to not only actually get people on the phone or to do interviews with you, but you have a great ability to sort of in a nice sort of relaxed manner, get them to open up and also dig under the surface and not ask a lot of just the typical questions that they might get in a more short form interview or for like a book press launch where they've got to do 10, 15, 20 interviews and it's the same questions over and over. So I don't know if you want to maybe talk some about your process or how you went about this.
Well, that's all lovely to hear. Thank you. My 2 favorite parts of writing books are researching obscure points of Bond culture or any culture that is something that we've always wondered about but don't know the answer or the context to, as well as talking to artists about their creative process. And I'll briefly speak about both. In terms of something that I always wanted to know about Bond was the and this is for the Lost Adventures book actually, is the Moonraker radio drama. I didn't
Yes.
understand the context for that. And I think it's in that book. It might have been in a different book I wrote, but and so I tracked down the Bob Holness's family, who shared with me the contract uh, that revealed the circumstances uh, of that broadcast and when it was actually done, because that was something that we never knew about, and how much was he paid. And I also published a letter that he wrote to a Bond fan named Brian McCaig. And I think that was actually maybe in the book Many Lives of James Bond that I wrote. It doesn't matter. So I like to get into these weird bits of trivia and understand it. And so I love research. I love trying to track down things that have presumably been lost. I love lost media. And the other thing I love is talking about, I love talking with artists about the creative process. And my interviews with the authors of the James Bond continuation novels roughly answers, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 different categories of, how were you selected? How did you write the books? How did you come up with the stories? What was it like to work with Ian Fleming Publications? What was the process of getting vetted? What was the process of coming up with the story and the characters? How much were you relying on Fleming? How much were you allowed to bring of yourself? Um, and then each interview, we go through every story that they've written. So for someone like Boyd, it's just one. It's one novel and 2 short stories. That's the other thing, is that when I was writing this other book, James Bond After Fleming, um, I learned that there were more short stories than I was previously aware of. I mean, I knew about Raymond Benson's published short stories, as well as the one that he wrote that didn't go to publication, at least originally, and was rewritten for a collection of books. But I was unaware that William Boyd wrote 2 short stories, very short stories that have a time travel element, where William Boyd goes back in time to interview James Bond, the character. So it was like, oh wow, look, there's as much as we know about Bond, there's so much more to discover. So with all of the authors, and there is a point somewhere in here, was I would go through every single aspect of their Bond writing and hit upon all their novels, all their novelizations, all their short stories, and ask all the questions that I imagined that a fan might have about not their process, but about plot points and what they did with the character and what they didn't do with the character. So yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I did really like how you tried to also talk about their other work, and sort of get them to talk about how they thought their own work, or how the Bond works that they did, how that may have fit within their own sort of body of work, or how they tried to bring themselves to it, or if they looked at it more as a job of work that they just got the opportunity to do, and they were like, oh well, I'll give this a go, but I don't really consider it part of my work. And in the same sort of area, how the sort of notion of the continuation novel moniker, how some people seem to embrace it, how some don't really like it. Is that really what you should call these works, or is it just something that we just kind of got used to referring to it as? So I was really interested to see how that was those were sort of continual themes that basically all the writers kind of brought up in some fashion as just part of this, because it's not a typical work of theirs. This was something outside of their wheelhouse, essentially. And then you have to look at, okay, which writers were diehard Bond fans and which ones really weren't and had to work at it, and how does that play into things. So I really thought those were some interesting themes, because each of the interviews had some degrees of that, so you could see there was a sort of consistency of, well, if you were tasked with this, depending on your level of fandom, how would you go about it? And everybody, I think, would have some degree of those questions, concerns. How much Fleming style do I try to have? How much of my voice can I retain? Did I even realize I was trying to imitate Fleming? And all that stuff. So I thought that was interesting that those themes kind of echoed in every interview.
Yeah, it's really interesting just in terms of, to piggyback on what you're saying about trying to imitate Fleming. Uh, one of the which I'll respond to my own self in a second. I just also want to say, for context, I also interviewed Corinne Turner, who is the managing director of Ian Fleming Publications,
That
and
was
she shared.
wonderful.
Yeah, that was. I mean, it's an extraordinary interview because with all these things, just like how these authors are selected is such a fascinating and previously to me obscure or unknown process. To see how that, to shed light on that, was really interesting. But now, just in terms of style and trying to copy Fleming, all the authors are given, when they, after they're vetted, and we can talk about the vetting process later if you want. After they're vetted, they're sent a complete set of Ian Fleming Bond books, and they already have them. But it's so cool. It's a way of welcoming into the family, that, as well as making sure that they reread all of the novels so that they could firmly put themselves in Fleming's world. They are told, don't worry about the other continuation works. Sometimes authors will give a tip of the hat or a nod, or in Raymond Benson's case, his Bond would reference Bond villains or past loves, and that's because he liked to do it. And sometimes that shows up even in later works of other authors. But these are really discrete stories that should be viewed independently of each other and not necessarily as part of one long Bond continuous timeline. Um, but so in terms of, and this is where I started, in terms of the language, for Sebastian Fox, who was writing a celebration of Fleming at Fleming Centennial, he was told to, the conceit of that book was write it in the style of Ian Fleming. So he did. He wasn't trying to do an exact pastiche. He thought that would be a little over the top, but he tried to get there. Um, if concentric circles, he wasn't intending for a bullseye. It was just to the left of the margin. Now, Kim Sherwood was structurally thinking of a different type of novel than Fleming wrote, who wrote straightforward. I mean, there were always twists and turns and reversals. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but narratively, there's a clean through line. And she was saying, I'm going to use different language than Fleming. I'm going to use a different structure than Fleming. He's telling the story of one hero. I'm going to do three heroes, and the language is not. I'm not going to attempt to copy Fleming. Now, Kim's clearly a Bond fan and a Fleming fan, and you'll see deep cuts and deep references to Fleming's works, and an extreme rigid understanding and love of Fleming, but she's not trying to copy his sentence structure or style.
Yeah, I think it's important for every writer to, if they somehow get this task and then somehow manage to come up with a plot, which is always the element that you think you can do, but until you sit down and you start actually thinking about it, then your palms start to sweat, and then you're like, this is ridiculously hard. But you have to find your own sort of foothold on how you would approach it, and I think it's important for every writer to, and they seem to have all realized this very very quickly, that they have to maintain their own sort of writing style. They can only do it their way from their perspective and do it the best they can, but always with the idea of, okay, we have to keep the sort of core elements, whether we make it a period setting or a modern day setting, and we try and reinvent a lot of things. You've got to keep the core of the character there and some of the core elements, otherwise it's not really a James Bond story anymore. And so that's why I've been interested. And at first, I was kind of surprised when IFP started. They changed from doing the standard that Gardner and Benson have been doing, of doing the sort of series of novels under a certain author that were direct continuations of one another. And then we had this sort of gap, and then sort of a relaunch, the sort of, I guess, second wave or second generation of continuation novels that were then basically one-offs of trying to get these bigger name authors to do like sort of their own take. And then we had the sort of branching off into the world of Young Bond that's now had two distinct different iterations. So I don't know if you have any opinions about the sort of difference between the sort of what I term the first and second generations of the styles of the continuation novels.
Yes, a lot of thoughts. It's a great observation. Um, uh, so one of the things that Corinne Turner at IFP, and IFP means Ian Fleming Publications for those who might not know or might not remember, sort of talked me through that whole history of how they went from series to one-offs and spin-off stories. I'll try to brief is not necessarily my strong suit, and I apologize,
You're
but I
preaching
will
to the
try
choir here.
to.
Anyone who's seen my videos, I can't. Those are my brief version.
But let me try to briefly hit the highlights. So, John, when Ian Fleming passed away, it wasn't a given that there'd be continuation novels. You know, Anne Fleming, who was not a fan of James Bond, correctly observed that Bond was a product of Ian Fleming, and trying to get another writer to do it, whether she liked Bond or not, wasn't a great idea. And at the time, she did have a great point. This was not, we're here. Star Wars is no longer controlled by George Lucas. We audience, Batman hasn't been written by Bob Kane and drawn by Bill Finger in a long time, um, uh, and on and on and on. So, but at the time, it was a little bit tacky. And when I first came across my first Bond continuation novel, I didn't understand it because I thought that just Ian Fleming wrote them, and I didn't understand how other people could. Um, but they needed to. They needed to make these for several reasons. One, because there was other people who were trying to make Bond stories without their permission or copyright. So one of their ways of protecting their copyright was using their copyright, because it's use it or lose it. And it also it also obviously brings in income. But Corinne Turner was at IFP was hitting home that the purpose of continuation novels in general is to preserve Fleming's legacy, preserve and promote. So the continuation novels themselves are meant to refer back to Fleming's work and spotlight him. But once they decided to go forward, and Fleming came up with the request or stipulation that when a manuscript is written, the family has to read it and make sure that it's up to their standards, and if it's not, don't publish it. That did happen originally with Per Fine Ounce, where they declined to publish it. But these days, and that had certain other factors on why they might not wanted to publish it. Anyway, although when you look at the pages that we have survived, it does seem interesting. It does seem worthwhile.
Oh yes, I want to see the whole
Yeah,
thing. I dug up
yeah.
those pages, and it's like
It's
It
great.
had to be. It had to be readable. Like, why?
Yeah,
This sounds good.
it absolutely does seem like it would have been really fun. Um, but they're not going. Ian Fleming Publications is not going to put an author in a position where they're going to spend an entire time writing a Bond novel and then just putting it in a drawer. Something extraordinary would have to happen for that to happen. So it's not an antagonistic relationship at all. It's a mutually supportive one where the authors feel the embrace of IFP and the family. Is generally speaking how it's characterized, and sometimes it's getting through a book is harder than another book, but it's all for the mutual benefit and love of preserving Fleming. Anyway, so they went after Gardner wrote so many books. He wrote more than Fleming, as all your listeners know. And that was going well. He mostly did a book a year. There were some breaks, but he mostly did a book a year, and everyone was sort of comfortable with that with that relationship. And he really was given more creative freedom, if you ask me, my personal opinion, than any other Bond continuation author since. I know he bristles at certain things that he would have liked to have done that he couldn't have done, which I wasn't able to interview him, but I did interview his son Simon, and Bond fan Bill Caddis gave me a letter that John Gardner wrote to Bill uh, about his books and his works and what he was doing, including where he's saying, "Well, I wanted to put AIDS, I wanted to address AIDS, and I was not allowed."
As a
So
longtime Gardner defender, that was really rewarding. I have to just interject there.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think how do you spotlight in an interview book? How do you spotlight him when he's no longer with us?
How do you talk
And
about his writing style when he's no
yeah,
longer with us? Yeah.
yeah, but so thankfully he was able to. His voice was heard through this letter and through his son Simon, who's also lovely. Um, but and then he had to stop after many books and a couple of novelizations, I want to say.
Yep.
Um, uh, and then Raymond Benson, Bond scholar, took over, and he wrote those 6 novels, 3 novelizations, and 3 published short stories. I think all the way through this, I'm going to be off about one thing or another. There's no proofreading
I know the feeling.
on
You're fine.
uh, on this, so please, audience, please forgive me when I'm off by a number. Um, and so for that period, there was a as you just said, there was a continuation of story, meaning that was all one Bond, having experienced all those same things through both authors. Although, as that's my impression as a Bond fan from an outsider, Raymond Benson will suggest that you view his work separately from John Gardner, even though there are those references. But as a Bond fan, at the time, at least, I thought of them as one continuity. Then IFP decided to take a little bit of a break on that. Uh, when you have this many books at this regular clip, it stops being an event, and it just becomes, and it for Bond fans, they're there, but for the general public and getting press, my opinion is that it becomes harder. So they and it felt like they felt like it might have run its course. So they put a pause on the Bond novels, and they said, "Well, what else can we do?" And someone that they brought in, had this idea where they did the young Bond with Charlie Higson, and the Moneypenny Diaries, which are extraordinary books and merit discussion.
I think they're just about the sleepers of the entire continuation novels.
Yeah, everyone who reads them loves them, but many people were under the misimpression that they were quote unquote chick lit,
And
and
then they
so
didn't print the others here in the US, so we're
yeah,
stuck without them. It's like you're
but
not helping their case.
no, but they're true Bond. I mean, they're true spy novels.
Yeah.
And And I also wrongly assumed that, you just see Bond, you know, running down the hallway, but he wouldn't really be part of the narrative. He's there. They're really, really good. And they're also true to Fleming's timeline. So they did those. They did the Young Bond Part One, Charlie Hicks and his five, um, and the Three Moneypenny. Then for the 100th anniversary, they changed strategies based on the market. Instead of doing these Bond thrillers, they got what they might they've described as more literary authors, and they got Sebastian Fox, William Boyd, and they got Jeffrey Deaver, and they each wrote one. And what's interesting about those from an outsider is the first one is period, the second one in that series is modern, and then the third one is period. And you look at them and you're like, oh, what's going on here? Why are they not? Why is that not all part of one arc, unofficial or official? And the answer is because that's what the authors wanted to do. Like if IFP did have their own wishes and they could have overrode the authors, but Jeffrey Deaver wanted to write a modern Bond, and for a lot of reasons. And the IFP said, okay, we support that decision. Now, I think I think it's important to note because I think sometimes there's an impression that IFP is trying to impose their will on the authors and micromanage them. But when you listen to the authors and you listen to IFP, they have their opinions and they do work with the authors. And if the authors wanted to put Bond in space, they might say no, or I think they would say no for that.
Unless somebody
But
had a really interesting pitch.
right. But it was important to Jeffrey Deaver to do it, and they understood his reasoning, and they said, "Okay, I know that's not following the last book, but let's do it." And so I think that sort of apparent inconsistency to an outsider might seem as a knock, but I think of it as a powerful company and an author working in collaboration to come up with something that works for both of them.
Yeah, it really reminds me, and it's partly how I've always viewed the continuation novels because I grew up in the 90s and I would get some of the continuation novels interchangeably with Fleming books because back then the Fleming books were out of print and I was just getting whatever I could get my hands on. So I was the kid who read Seafire like 20 times because it's what my local library had. They had a copy of Casino Royale and they had a copy of Seafire where we were living at the time. It was very limited, your choices. And so I just read them interchangeably and I knew they were different, but there was at least enough elements that were unified. But I also was a Star Wars fan, and I was heavily into the Star Wars expanded universe. And reading the interview with IFP that you did, that sort of helped to further define how they partner with each author. And it reminded me of how the actual Star Wars expanded universe pre-Disney, how that was sort of run of having a sort of managing group that would be there to sort of, to support all the authors. We don't want to get in your way. We don't want to tell you what to do. We like your idea. But when you submit your stuff to us, we'll just make little pointers as you go about, oh, well, this is all great, but this here, it does kind of conflict with this other thing, or, George doesn't necessarily like that particular direction. So if you wouldn't mind maybe just adjusting it, basically just being there as a sort of guiding hand in a way when necessary. And so that way you didn't get something that came out that was totally off kilter and didn't necessarily fit having Star Wars on the cover, but also having a bunch of different approaches and sort of spin-offs and one-offs with all these different authors. And so as time goes on, and IFP has been doing this more and more, and each one is sort of a different approach that not only gives you sort of the flavor of it being an event with each book, but it does, for me at least, sort of harken back to how the Star Wars expanded universe back in the day would have kind of out there things, or they'd have an author who wanted to do a trilogy of some aspect of the prequels, or they would have suddenly an author would do a duology about a particular story, and it was like a sort of side thing, and you could decide if you wanted to delve into that or not, and some things would be more to your taste and some wouldn't, but it was all one part of one collective whole, and there was a feeling of at least some degree of consistency.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes we fans get a little bit too bogged down with canon, which is to say what happened and fidelity to that canon, and making sure that the events happened here for across all the books. And Marvel in the films has done that well, and that is one model of storytelling. And for the first 25 Marvel films or whatever, it worked very, very, very well for them. Um, but it's not an approach that IFP is taking, and I personally prefer that. I like the idea of giving authors more ownership of where they could take the story, and I also think that means that you get more stories. You know, if you only have one single narrative across the books, you have to be very diligent in how they come out. But without, when you're not beholden to that, you get a trilogy from Kim Sherwood about the other double O agents, or you get Charlie Higson's modern Bond, which came out of
It's a
nowhere.
braver choice. It's a lot
Yeah,
harder and riskier. So I always tip my hat to them for taking that approach, because not everybody's going to. You just look at the way that a lot of authors' estates have all of these books come out by a variety of different authors, and they just put the name on there, and like every time I look, there's suddenly like another 5 Jason Bourne novels, and I'm like, where did these come from? And you try to read one of them, and it's just like, what is this I'm reading? And it's like, did somebody just rubber stamp this and say, okay, we can, and I'm sure some are better than others, and I haven't read all of them, but it just seems like a completely different approach that some estates even take with sort of licensing the name or certain characters out just to have something out there.
yeah, and I think fans are sophisticated enough to know the difference between those all these different strategies, from a licensed work by an estate that feels like a licensed work by an estate, versus, you know, one storyline versus multiple storylines, or what comics, you know, sometimes call else worlds. And
Right.
it's variety, you know, and
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's usually what when people ask me about, if they ask me, because it's hard enough to find literary Bond fans, and then when you try to pull out your I'm a continuation novel nerd fan card, people really go like, oh, I got to get away from this dude. He's going to talk about books. I don't read the books. But if I ever am talking about some of these more modern ones that are sort of unique one-offs, the way I usually describe it to people is, okay, imagine this as a DC Elseworlds or something, where it's, yes, it's the characters, but it's a little bit different. It's a particular take. It's like an arc of a comic book from a particular team that is just taking everything in a certain direction, and it's a particular take.
yeah, but you know, it's funny, you know, when I was interviewing Anthony Horowitz, I said something, you know, I explained the premise of the book, and you know, I said, oh, you know, the James Bond novels, continuation novels, are just as worthy of consideration as Ian Fleming's, and he said, I wonder if I agree with that. And you know, you know, you know, so he kind of agrees with your, you know, people who are saying, what are you talking about? His point is that there are good continuation novels, and maybe there are some that are less successful or that don't speak to the reader, but none of them really compete with Ian Fleming. So it is really funny, because this is, you know, I just go, you know, I do love your notion of spin-offs of spin-offs of spin-offs, and you know, subsets of Bond fandom and interest. Something you said sparked that memory. I don't know if I should be responding to a different point you made, but that was the point
No, that's all
that
right. Yeah, I'll admit I'm the guy who still wonders, I've read rumors about some of the Gardner Bond novels having significant edits and like UK text or sometimes significantly longer. Oh gosh, I have to find all the British editions, don't I? And I've been trying to find what I can looking at like page count numbers because I've always read like Man from Barbarossa was supposed to be a significantly altered text, but I'm like, I don't know if the US or UK version is the proper one. So have I been reading a cut down version all these years? So, and it's not, this information isn't around anywhere. So I have an eBay save search for British John Gardner editions because I'm that guy. So I managed to, not that I'm trying to flex or anything, but I did manage to get this nicer early printing of License Renewed. So yeah, I have many James Bond eBay save searches. Which actually, I wanted to ask before I forgot. What was your history with the continuation books? Did you sort of encounter them at a certain point and then just keep up as much as you could? Were you devouring each one as they came
no.
out?
I was sort of before I started these projects, I was sort of a more casual Bond continuation fan, where if I saw one that looked interesting, I'd pick it up.
Right.
I hadn't read all, there's over 50. Some of them are behind me.
Oh yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
I can recognize the Gardner U.S.
Oh,
editions
the tippy
anywhere.
top, right? Yeah.
Anywhere, because that was part of my childhood looking in used bookshops. I was looking for Fleming and Gardner editions because this was just as the Benson novels had started coming in. And I remember getting those in Books A Million when they would come out in paperback because I was a kid and couldn't afford the hardcover versions.
Yeah. So the first one I read was the authorized biography of James Bond. I should say it's the first one I purchased. I purchased it in paperback at a bookstore that was either in Grand Central or just outside. I don't know if it was connected or not. Not that that matters. But that was the one that I was really confused about because not only is that an atypical, not only was it a continuation novel, but it was even atypical for its kind in that
Yeah.
it wasn't a proper novel. It was I wouldn't call it a biography, even though they call it the unauthorized or the authorized biography of 007, because it's not a biography. It really is a third
It's
person.
hard to define. Like there have
Yeah,
been some works like that since, and actually just recently it finally dawned on me that it's in a way similar to Fleming's Diamond Smugglers and how he recounted himself doing the
yeah. Right,
interview with the
right.
operative and like fictionalized what he actually did. So I was like, oh, how did that take me so long to realize? But I got that pretty young too. That was one of the first books I had. It certainly confused me the first time I read it when I was
Yeah, I
like
didn't
10.
understand it.
And it took me many years to sink in, and I'm like, oh, okay. So this is just playing around as if it was a real person. So it's a fictional novel that's a biography that's not a biography of someone who doesn't exist, but what if they
Exactly.
did? And then is this
It's very meta.
canon? Is it not canon? Eh,
Right, and certain elements of it have quasi become canon.
right. Over time, they just kind of
Some
seeped
of them
in.
haven't. It's like
Mhm.
you know. Uh, but when I had this idea of writing uh, this book, James Bond After Fleming,
Your
this is the one
tome,
that's
your
the
essential
guide.
tome.
Yeah. Oh, so this is artwork by Sean Longmore. He did both of these. I'll hold up
I
the other
was
one.
going to mention that the artwork on your books has always been sensational, but
Right, and
these
that's
latest
Sean next to
ones
you. Yeah.
with the collage sort of idea, I mean, they are brilliantly done. I've sat there and been poring over, and I'm like, I'm just trying to figure out which is referencing which book because it's like it's catnip for us continuation novel nerds.
And then Pat Carbajal
Oh
in
gosh, those are amazing. The
Argentina,
internal
he also did.
illustrations.
Yeah, like it's a book, so there's not a movie. And so I said, what if you illustrate moments from the Bond novels that are just iconic? So, whether it's, torture in the eye, or here Bond is being stripped and dunked in freezing cold water. Maybe we could illustrate those and see them. But when I had this idea for this book, I was like, that means I'm gonna have to read, over 50 novels. Like, is that it? Is that a good idea? Is that doable?
I do it. I reread them. It takes
So
a
I
while,
did.
though.
Yeah, it did. It took a while. And some of them some of them I was familiar with, and some of them I wasn't. And that's sort of the purpose of that book, is to either be an entryway to these Bond continuation novels if you're unfamiliar with them, or if you have read them, to look at them from another point of view. And I try to come up with what I think the author was trying to do and make a case for that.
No,
That's my
absolutely.
strategy.
Yeah, before I forget, I wanted to mention that the illustrations inside this book, most people are probably going to think, well, how can you do interesting illustrations if it's a book of interviews with authors? But the particular style of doing this sort of, I mean, it looks like a Fleming portrait in a way. That's the sort of aesthetic.
Yeah, it's great. That was
And
Pat.
having
So
what looks like their a version of their Bond,
yeah,
and this and they're all matching. I'm like,
yeah, that was Pat's
I could
idea.
see these as prints on a wall. They're so well done.
Yeah, I love his illustrations, and that was his idea. It was to do the author, and then put a little figure to represent their character, their hero, their Bond. And so we did that throughout. First, and for Kim Sherwood's, first we had one with Bond, but because the premise of book one is that James Bond is missing, we went with one of the agents.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
you
it's
got to
like,
pick somebody else.
yeah, but people also like to see pictures and books and illustrations. Uh, uh, I remember before one of my books came out, I got like a 1 star. Before they read it, they gave me a 1 star review saying that there might not be pictures in it. It's like, I was like, why don't you look to see if there's illustrations in it before I get the 1 star review? But I remember getting knocked for
Yeah.
it even before it came out. People like to when you have a thing with a lot of text, it helps to visually break it up. So part of that is you can't do stills uh, from movies, because those they don't exist. And the other thing I think about stills from movies and Bond books is that we all have seen them before. What can you add what can you do that would be additive and give the reader something new?
Not to mention, stills cost money for licensing, and you have to
Yeah,
get
yeah, yeah,
permissions,
yeah,
and it's a lot more difficult than people realize.
yeah.
But of course, I don't mind having a giant reference tome that's nothing but text when it's a book like one of yours, because I'm like this with it in front of my face, just like. And the fact that you put, in the opening dedication, and mentioning all of the fans who devour these books, I'm like, that's me. That's me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There. Even and the thing is, with all of the continuation books, there's going to be some that don't necessarily gel with some fans, or have elements that you can criticize or pick apart. But the thing with all of them is, I like all of them, even the ones that are a bit, like some of the later Gardner ones certainly have a bit of stuff that is you read Cold Fall again and you're like, what am I reading here? But I still like it. I enjoy getting to sift through it and sort of dissect it over the years and mull over it and come to it again a couple years later. And I was going to ask you that, if in doing this and hearing about all the writers' processes, did it actually influence your own opinion of say any of the works that you had read, or maybe one that was not higher up on your list? Did it like make you do a 180 and go, oh, I hadn't thought of that before?
Yeah, so the way the first book, the James Bond After Fleming, the guide to these books, I hadn't spoken to any of the authors. and I just responded to the books based on the text of the books. So it was only within whatever happened in those pages, that's what I would respond to, and that's what would quote unquote count.
Yeah,
Not
I think that's the right way to go. Have
yeah.
that sort of objective focus.
And then for this other thing, after I wrote James Bond After Fleming, then I started to do the interviews with everyone. And my what you just said, does it change your point of view? My hope is that yes, it does. My hope is that if you've got your favorite Bond book and you read their interview, it'll give you a deeper appreciation for that book. But my other hope is that if you have your least favorite Bond book, you read what that author said about what they were trying for, and you go, oh, um, that's what they were doing. Let me reconsider what that is. And so what one might think is a fault, at an inherent level, it was actually a strategy. And then my hope is that people go back and go, oh, as you do, and reread them and go, oh, okay, I see what I see what he or she is doing there.
Yeah, because this stuff it ebbs and flows, and you come to it at different points in your life, and especially if you start to consider how difficult it is to come up with a new plot that hasn't been used before, and what do you do with the character, and I've had that just in rereading the books over the years, and ones that I just didn't frankly get as much as a kid, or were harder to get into. They read differently when you're in your 20s and 30s, or when you've read it 4 or 5 times, or what the author was trying to do, or more about their writing style because you've read some of their non-Bond works, or the background of the contract they had, and what their orders were like. Until Raymond Benson started saying in interviews that his directive was sort of to, at least in some ways, emulate some of the style of the films, that was a major light bulb moment for me, because it suddenly solidified some of the ideas I had had about his books, and also some of the stuff that I would see fans criticize in forums and talk about, because if you didn't know that, all you could do is say, oh, because some people would say, oh, these are too much like the movies. And then when you said, well, my directive was to emulate the film, like, well, there it is. We
Yeah,
now have it.
that's a really important point, is that these books are not written or published in a vacuum.
Mhm.
They are written and published based on mandates. Those mandates are based on IFP, what they want in a book, as well as market forces. So to compare, one author with another author and say, well, they are further or closer to Fleming, is not necessarily strictly the point. The point is, what are the conditions under which they wrote the book? So if Benson's mandate is to take the Bond character and preserve the characters written by Fleming, but put that character in movie-like adventures, then that changes everything about how you should read or view Benson's work. For instance, you sort of must keep that in mind and say, well, he wasn't trying to tell a completely pure Fleming story from Fleming's point of view. He was trying to tell Fleming's character in a movie style adventure, and that permeates to everything.
Yeah, and
And
that's
the
an
same,
even harder
yeah,
challenge.
yeah. And the same thing with Kim Sherwood's books, is that she is not trying to emulate, as we've said, she's not trying to emulate Fleming. She's trying to do something different with her characters and her narrative. And also, if you're going to do a Bond novel, it's inaccurate. Just let me say two things. One, I'll say something that I think is inaccurate. It's hard to do a Bond novel where Bond's not in it. The inaccurate part is Bond is in her books, and that's not a spoiler. Let me get to that in 1 second. But if the premise is that Bond is missing, you don't want to send agents out to get him that are exactly like Bond, but just have a different name. that doesn't make sense. Otherwise, if you're going to do that, just write a Bond novel. Your agent should be different than Bond, so that there's conflict and that there's differences. The inaccurate part of the Bond's not in the first Bond book, which is not a spoiler, is that not only is he referenced all the time, but he's discussed all the they have discussions about him all the time, and there's always like flashbacks to events that were going on that Bond was a part of, and where they're always thinking of him. So he's and every character has a deep relationship to Bond in that book.
His
So
presence is on every page. I
his
mean,
presence is, yeah.
It's the same thing with Sherlock Holmes and The Final Problem. And suddenly there's the period where Sherlock Holmes isn't around, but his presence is felt on every page. And then, of course, I mean, ideally the reader knows that at some point the character is going to reappear.
Yeah.
It's how this stuff works. So, but it's not to say, oh well, they're not in the book. It's not a Bond novel. It's not important. Like, well, no, it's in the world. Their presence is on every page. They are mentioned consistently by characters who worked with him and had close relations with him on a day-to-day basis. So yes, it's just a different approach.
Yeah. And keep in mind, no one has to like all of these novels or any of
Right.
these novels. Not every, as you were saying, not every book is meant for every person. There's going to be segmentation. There's going to be, they are sometimes directed for a segment of the audience that may not be you.
Yeah, and they're also having to consider and always keep in mind, okay, well, we want to still make sure that anybody can pick up this and enjoy it, and they don't have to have any knowledge. So it
Right.
has to work as a standalone book first and be a good book that
Right.
is good for the character and can be, thus sold as a James Bond work of some type. But you've got to always make sure that it works as its own standalone work, because
Right.
otherwise most people are going to open it to page one and go, this doesn't make sense to me, and they put it back on the shelf.
Right. You shouldn't need a PhD in Bond to pick up on these. Although having a PhD in Bond, I think
I was
often
about to
help to
say,
deepen one's
what
understanding.
institution offers this? Because I think I have my prerequisites. So let me make sure, because there's one more thing I wanted to ask. Oh yeah. So this doesn't get discussed a lot, but I think there's a certain, of course, the films are much more visible and much more famous. So already the literary Bond is usually confined to a certain part of the James Bond fan base and a certain part of general readership who's into Fleming, and then there's like an even smaller group that is into or aware of or has at least read some of the continuation works. But over time, it's seemed like there's been less and less publisher support for them, especially here in the US, because at least with IFP continuing to try new things and doing all those rather impressive book launches in the UK, or sometimes the authors are asked, oh, do you want to do some stunt work or something crazy? And they're like, I don't want to die, actually. Which is amusing, and I'd be the same way. But then you contrast that with the US launches, which usually are significantly delayed and there's no sort of launch. They just appear. And sometimes, as with the Moneypenny Diaries follow-ups, we didn't even get them. Or with the Kim Sherwood books, there's a super long delay. And then it's just like you suddenly have some copies appear in your local Barnes and Noble, maybe. And then with the recent relaunch of the Fleming reprints, those were extremely just kind of tossed off, and they did three at the start, and then did one at a time, sort of like scattered, and the cover art designs are very uninspired. And so there's always just this general feeling of there's not like a sense of the same level of support from American publishers, especially when it comes to the continuation works. Like, for some reason, they don't seem to think that a James Bond book will actually sell.
Yeah, when you're right. Currently, the U.S. doesn't embrace Bond continuation nearly as much as they do in the UK. When Sebastian Fox did Devil May Care for the 100th birthday for Fleming Centennial, it was huge. It got a lot of press.
Yeah, that was like the one time I remember there being some
Yeah, it was like
press
Harry
and
Potter level of
front of the
success.
bookstore, but of course that was when we still had more bookstores, so it's a different publishing world. But yeah, that was like the one time I remember, because even in the 90s and 2000s, and I was a kid, and I would just notice that suddenly there was a new Raymond Benson novel and I had no clue, and it had already been out for months. And I know the Gardner novels started with License Renewed. There was a push, but it's like, even that, if you look at it, that started to fade off. So especially by the time of the early 90s, there wasn't any of the same degree of uh, market awareness outside of the people who were buying each and every book.
Right. I will say this. I think I have three things to say, and I'll probably
Mhm.
remember two of them.
Okay.
One, right now, UK more than US for the continuation novels. When Gardner and Benson were doing it, I believe that the sales were better, certainly with Benson in the US than they were in the UK. That's one thing. It used to be more US that over UK in terms of uh, sales and popularity in bookstores. That's one. Number two is that has changed. What was I going to say? Um, that this is not IFP's doing, meaning people say what you just said accurately, what you accurately reported, but then they blame IFP.
Right.
Um, it's in IFP's interest to have as much interest in America as they do in the UK. I personally don't believe that they are being supported by the US publishers in the same way that the UK publishers do. I think that the
Yes.
US publishers, through for whatever reason, maybe based even on part of experience, believe that the books aren't as popular here. So that's more of a publisher issue than an IFP, who would be thrilled if to have that level of interest. Um, and I forgot, as promised, I forgot the third one, but it was going to be a really important point, and the world would have applauded me greatly for having made it.
And you start to hear a heavenly choir singing.
What was I saying? It's gone. But yeah, I had one more. It was good. I can't remember. Anyway.
Well, what I was going to say was, that's why I was so excited that you were delving into the continuation novels, and now you've
Oh,
done a whole. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
okay. Okay. This is not this is not great. But when the books first came out in the U.S. with Gardner, they were New York Times bestsellers. There were full page. There were not, I don't know, full page. There were ads everywhere for it. And then what happens is and the first bunch, I can't remember what number, 4 or 5, were New York Times bestsellers. But what happens is when you do 14 of a series, whatever, as a general rule, unless you're Harry Potter, there's going to be a decline.
Oh yeah, it's the same with films and box office. You're
Exactly.
going to have that, whether it's audience fatigue or
Yeah.
market shifts, there's going to be that sort of fall off. But you can always tell by just looking for used copies, because there are millions of paperbacks and less hardcover editions, but some. But when you're, of course, I know this because this is how I had to get the Bond novels. I had to search used bookstores, and you'll still, to this day, you'll find copies of License Renewed, for Special Services, Icebreaker, Roll of Honor, and really through Nobody Lives Forever. Basically, the first 5 Gardeners are still relatively in circulation. But after that, starting with No Deals, Mr. Bond, they start getting less and less and less, and it's very difficult to get an original paperback of, say, Cold Fall, because that had seemingly the smallest print run and had a
Yeah.
different cover design, and that was 96 by that point when they had done that. And of course, there were finally the reprints, which I was so happy to see that the Gardner
Yeah.
books finally got reprinted. But you can actually put this stuff together yourself, just looking around and thinking about, oh, well, is there a reason why I see why I'm looking at this shelf in the used bookstore and there's 2 random beat up Fleming editions? I've never seen a copy of Colonel Sun for like the past 5 years floating around, but yet here's 3 beat up copies of License Renewed, 2 copies of 4 Special Services, 3 Icebreakers, and nothing else. Like, so it leaves traces of itself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted to I wanted to make sure I make that point about how I don't think the U.S. publishers have been doing the continuation books any favors in terms of making people more aware of them. And so
No.
you really feel alone when you're so excited about the new book coming out, and whether you like the approach or not, you're just excited to dig into it, and then you find out you mean I have to wait a year and a half. And so then you literally import the UK edition, and then finally, like a year later, you happen to notice that, oh, that's the US edition on a random back shelf at Barnes and Noble with a 20% off sticker on it, and they only have 1 copy. Does anybody know this exists?
Yeah, I think that's a problem. Yeah. Getting
Yeah.
awareness, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I think the key with all the continuation books is there's not a degree of awareness. I think some people might know there's some continuation books, but they may not know how
Right. I mean,
many.
yeah. I mean,
And
that's
that's
my
why
hope
your books are
with
so important.
thank you. I mean, that's my hope with these things, is that it collects. My hope is that it collects the stories in one place, and it gives people a chance to, like, I'm trying to get everything under one tent, collect them, and then you could use that as a starting point to follow ideas that interest you, because all 50 plus books are not as easily available as others. You go, well, this is what we're working with. These are all the stories. These are all the conditions in which they were made. I go forth and explore.
Branch off from there. Yeah, you've
Yeah.
you've done a brilliant job at condensing and bringing all this stuff together, because before this point, there wasn't anything that did that. You could sit there and read the Wikipedia pages, and you could dig through Bond forums, or go on wonderful sites like the Book Bond and see some of the images of the
Yeah, right. Yeah.
covers, and read some blog posts and articles about specific books. But having there wasn't necessarily a particular resource of where somebody could come in cold, no pun
Yeah.
intended, with the Last Gardner book in the UK version. Um, but where somebody could come in, have never read any Bond novels, let's just say that, and they're like, well, what about all these other ones? What about this one I saw in the bookstore? And just come in, and now they have something to turn to be able to go, oh, well, I didn't know about this one sounds interesting. Deaver did this complete modern Bond. How does that work? Let me go look at that, and then let me go, and the idea of having a headhunt for James Bond sounds interesting. Let me go read Gardner's Nobody Lives Forever. What, and go from there, and sort of make your own journey, which I think always helps somebody have a more distinct connection to the material. Regardless of what form of media it is, you need that sort of direct connection that keeps you involved, whether you wind up liking the book or not.
Yeah. Well said. Well said.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be plugging these books like crazy, because these are the
Thank
kinds
you.
of books I've waited my whole Bond existence for, because especially growing up and reading the continuation novels alongside Fleming, and then never being able to talk about them, outside of like the particular subgroup on certain Bond forums that had a literary section. So, and you see
Well,
the
yeah,
same people on those. So it's not like there's a lot of us.
yeah. As we wrap up, that's my hope, is that you'll get these and you're having a conversation with a fellow fan and a friend and an enthusiast and a scholar who has the same questions that you, the reader, might have about these things, and that you read these books and we can sort of figure it out together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And each Bond book that you've done has been something that was extraordinarily well put together and well thought out. And as you said, with your sort of fascination with lost media, trying to dig deeper and it really it's each book you've done is a book with a purpose. It's definitely something that I think is going to be rewarding to fans who maybe don't have any knowledge of this stuff, or fans who've never read one of the continuation books or even thought of anything outside of the films. But they're also extraordinarily rewarding for us Bond nerds because you've managed to get some incredible interviews and find some incredible documentation and materials, and really dig into this stuff. And it's stuff that really hasn't been documented to this level, or even some of the interviews in Keeping 007 alive. You managed to get interviews with everybody.
Yeah,
And
isn't that crazy?
some I know I was just amazed flipping through, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he got them too. He got them too.
Yeah, I
And a
couldn't
lot of
believe
them
that
only
they all
got to
spoke to
do
you.
the basic PR stuff when their books came out, and then they haven't really gotten to discuss at length about it since.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is that that's the nice thing about interviewing someone, not when they're on the PR, but when there's a little distance between them and the
Right.
project. I think you get more honest answers, and they also have a little bit of perspective of time, which helps.
Absolutely. And that was another rewarding part of this last book, of reading through and getting to see how they could look back on it. And would they do it again? Would they do it the same way? And again, I think this will give everybody either a newfound appreciation for the books they've read, or greater insight into works they haven't gone into yet, but also of how difficult this is.
Yeah,
It's such a tightrope to walk. So until you try doing it yourself, it's easier said than done.
absolutely.
So before we finish up, I just wanted to see, do you have anything you'd like to plug, or where can people find you online?
I'm on Blue Sky under Mark Edlitz. I'm on Twitter at Mark Edlitz. The books can, I think, probably the easiest way to get the books, James Bond After Fleming and Keeping Wilson Alive, are through Amazon. You can get them through other places, but I think that's I think that's the easiest and the quickest way to get them, is my general impression. If anyone gets them, if they could please give a 5-star review. These are smaller books and need help finding an audience, and so it's one of the reasons so great to talk to you, Spencer. And so if anyone can give a 5-star review, it'll help other Bond fans learn about it. And if anyone's made it this far in the interview, um, or has ever read anything that I've ever done, I'm grateful for both, or either.
Well, we are certainly all, as Bond fans, richer from having your works. Each one has been I mean, each one is a treasure, and they're going right on my reference shelf, next to they are part of the core reference works. So they
Way too
are they
kind.
are
Thank you.
perfect for they are completely approachable for newcomers, but they are also filled to the brim for us diehards, which is something that I rarely come across. So these have been some of the most enjoyable new reference works that I've been able to dive into, because I'm just like, I've always wanted to know this. Nobody's ever gone into this. How did he find this? How did he get an interview? Oh my gosh. How did you get, and just one last tidbit, if people were not already interested enough, if you made it to the end of this, you got Bruce Fierstein to write an
Oh
introduction
yeah,
for your book, which I had no idea going.
right.
And I turned the page, I'm like, what?
Yeah, if you don't know, Bruce wrote 3 Bond novels and a bunch of video game, not excuse me, not Bond movies. He did 3 Pierce Brosnan Bond movies, and he also wrote a bunch of Bond video games. And isn't that cool that he he wrote the forward? Like we should have that should have been the only thing we've been talking about. Who cares what I have to say? He wrote the forward to the book, which was super nice of him.
Oh yeah, and it had his sort of trademark humor in there too,
Yeah.
and I was just
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, even Bruce Fierstein knows the continuation books. This is great. So yeah, there's something on every page for a Bond fan, and again, you don't have to be a lifelong obsessive, which I admit that's my sort of self descriptor, because they're so well put together and so approachable that they're great for diving into the stuff if you are completely new to the sort of expanded Bond world outside of just the films. So I know that's something that's not easy to do, even just trying to summarize plots and not give too much away and everything, because I myself have a lot of difficulty trying to condense things down and summarize. And so I just want to say you've done such a great job with these, and these are essential Bond reference works, and I can't wait to see where you might go in the future, whether it's with Bond or other media works as you've done. They are each of them, I think, indispensable.
Oh, thank you, Spencer. That means a lot.
Oh yeah, and I don't say that lightly, because I don't say that about every Bond book. I try to read every Bond book, but most of the time I already know most of everything that's in the general reference work. So when I get something like this, I'm like, I am literally I'm not physically eating it, but I'm literally devouring the text as I go along.
Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem. So this has been wonderful,
My
and
pleasure.
if you ever want to come back on the channel or have another chat, or if you do another Bond book or any book, I would be so happy to have you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Alrighty, so everybody look up Mark on his social media handles, which I'll have linked in the description. I'll also have links to his Bond books and other works. Please go and check them out. And if you've read them, definitely leave good reviews, because that makes the algorithm happy. And if the algorithm is happy, then we can get great works like this that are, not from major publishers. We can get it to more people, and hopefully as many Bond fans as possible. So thank you so much, Mark, for being here. This has been an absolute blast.
Thank you.